Hey, Developer Week. It's good to be back. My name is Peter Hawker, and I'm one of the product managers at PDFtron. One of the topics that we did previously during Developer Week, and which was really popular afterwards on our YouTube channel, was around the different PDF libraries that are out there. So in this talk, I want to take a step back and focus a bit more on the technology that powers all these different options. My background is in the engineering and construction industry, so I'm going to take a look at the different items today from that perspective. When you look around, it looks like there's dozens of different PDF libraries. However, under the hood, there are really only 3 options on the market. 2 of the PDF engines are actually built into your native web browsers. Let's say you open a PDF in a new tab. If you're using Google Chrome or Microsoft Edge, the PDF will be rendered by an engine called PDFium. If you're using Mozilla Firefox, the PDF will be rendered using one called PDF.js. Both of these rendering engines are open source. However, if you're building a mission-critical application where the performance and available features are top priority, then an open source solution may not be enough, and a commercial, closed-source PDF engine may be required. Let's go through each one of those options and take a look at how the different engines stack up. The main aspects that we'll consider in our evaluation are performance, the out-of-the-box features, as well as highlighting which features are most important from an architecture, engineering, and construction, or AEC mindset, and we'll finish off, since it's on everyone's mind these days, with a discussion on security. To be respectful of everyone's time, I've recorded this talk ahead of time to ensure we have lots of time for questions at the end. Let's take a look at PDFium first. As I mentioned before, PDFium is the open source engine that powers PDF viewing in Google Chrome, so it's probably the most used PDF viewer around the world these days. PDFium was originally open source in 2014 and is written in C++. Let's take a look at the out-of-the-box performance and the features you get with PDFium. I'm going to use 3 different test files to compare performance and features. We'll use just a standard 2-page contract, very basic. We'll use the Income Tax Act of Canada, which is almost 20 megabytes and more than 3,000 pages. And then we'll look at a standard 2D engineering drawing to give us that AEC context. Let's start with the standard document. I've got it on my local computer here. Let me just drag it over. There we go. That loads pretty quickly. So what do I get for features out of the box? On the left-hand side, I have a menu that opens up what looks like thumbnails. Jumps back and forth between pages pretty quickly. Does a bit of a flash when I open and close it, though. Looks like it re-renders the page, perhaps. I've got some page controls, including zoom up at the top. I can rotate my pages. Looks like it rotates the entire document, and I don't know if I have an option to rotate just one individual page. And then on the right-hand side, I can save, print, and well, that's about it looks like. I have some document properties as well. What else do we get? So by default, I see I can have text selection, which looks not too bad, reasonably smooth. What about searching? Searching looks like it leverages the built-in browser search, but that's not a terrible experience. Looks like my items are listed in the sidebar here, and it shows how many search results come back and highlights it on the page for me. All right, let's try the Income Tax Act of Canada next. Paste that in. Taking a few minutes to load here, well, seconds to load here, but looks like it's downloading and nothing's being displayed until the full file is downloaded locally to my computer. Just wait for this to come through. Okay, there it is. So, outlines on the side again. I've got the thumbnails that I can jump between. Looks like I have another option here for the document outline. So I guess if this PDF has different headings and things that are listed as the outline within the PDF, then I can jump back and forth between those as well. That's useful. Still does that flash when I open and close the outline though. Same options up at the top here. Really the only other things I should guess I'll look at will be the text selection with a larger document. This is a very long document. Text selection with oh, that's interesting. It looks like my text selection is, I have 2 columns here, one in English, one in French, but my text selection jumps across to the other column before it goes down, which isn't ideal necessarily. What about searching? Searching looked pretty good, similar to what we had before. Lots of results for this search term. Well, this is useful. So it's bringing up a search item that's broken across 2 lines. So computing here being hyphenated, and it still finds it. So that's pretty good. Okay, let's look at a construction document next. I'll drag one in here from my local computer. Takes a minute to pop in, but not too bad. It's a pretty complex document. Outline on the side, which doesn't really mean too much for this particular document. One thumbnail, because it's one, boy, there we go. One large document. Some of the limitations I can see here, of course, I mean, in PDFium is basically a PDF viewer. So from an engineering and architectural or construction point of view, there's no shape tools or measurement tools or annotations that I can add on top of this. And those are very important within engineering, of course. One of the other things, let us look at the zoom performance. So I can zoom in on an area. I don't have a pan tool or a hand tool to grab the canvas and move around, so that's a limitation as well. Let's see if I can zoom in on this area here to keep centering my page. Okay, so I can see there's lots of detail here, but I've maxed out my zoom and I can't seem to go any further than a 500% zoom. Perhaps not a big deal for a document like we looked at before, but when it comes to something like a CAD file like this, then I need more zoom than 500%. 500% just isn't adequate. All right, let's talk a little bit about security next. One of the issues with using PDFium in your solution is a side effect of its success. Since Google Chrome has gone on to become the most used web browser in the world, security has become a bigger concern. This makes PDFium a bigger target, and any identified vulnerabilities are scrutinized by a larger audience. More than 100 major vulnerabilities have been identified in PDFium and tracked in the CVE database since its release in 2014. PDFium-related vulnerabilities identified in Chrome will often be patched quickly, but this makes management of your solution more difficult and means that keeping your users up to date is absolutely crucial. All right, let's take a look at pdf.js next. So what is pdf.js? Well, pdf.js was originally released by Mozilla back in 2011 and uses the web standards-based HTML5 canvas to render PDFs. pdf.js is also used under the hood by a number of other open source and commercial products. But how does it compare to PDFium? Well, let's use our test files to find out and start with the standard 2-pager document we looked at before. Let me just drag it over from my local computer here. There we are. Loads up pretty quick. Similar, slightly different than PDFium up at the top, but I've got my different page selection options, zoom in the center. I've got the same outline. Looks like I'm not re-rendering every time this opens like it did in PDFium, so that's kind of a nice change. I've got thumbnails by default, but I've got a few more options too. I've got a document outline like we saw in PDFium. I can also, it looks like, view attachments that are embedded within the PDF, so that's a bit more advanced feature, as well as layers, and we'll get to that more, I think, when we look at the CAD file. Over on the right-hand side, I've got a couple more options here as well. I've got my rotation options, and it looks like I've got a hand tool, so we can utilize that and see how it behaves with the CAD file also. From a text selection point of view, it's not too bad. Jumping around a little bit, but overall reasonably, oh, there it goes, reasonably smooth. Searching looks about the same as well. All right, let's look at a little more complex file. So, streaming down the Income Tax Act. One cool thing here, though, is that it started to load the file even before everything has been downloaded onto my computer. So for a large file like this, this is a big value add. Scrolling functionality is pretty good. I've got the same outline that we saw in PDF, and we don't need to cover that one again. Let me jump ahead a little bit. See how text selection works. So text selection, hey, this is a little bit better. Looks like I'm selecting the full, let's see if it works here. Looks like for the most part, well, it jumped across there, but looks like for the most part it's recognizing this is one column and that the French is a separate column. So kind of a little bit hit or miss, but not too bad. Let's take a look for search functionality too. I want to find that term we looked for before, computing, that was broken across the page, because I don't think pdf.js is going to be able to find it. Here it is here. So if I search for computing, it's going to give me lots of different options. And it finds this one, and it finds this one on page 36, but unfortunately it doesn't find this one in the middle. So this is a bit of a limitation of pdf.js. The search functionality built in isn't quite as good. And sometimes, depending on your use case, that's not so bad. But other times, if perhaps a legal context or a financial context, really every single search term needs to come back, because that can be a huge issue if it doesn't. All right, let's take a look at our CAD file next. Drag it in locally. It's taking a little bit longer to render than it did with PDF. On the left-hand side, I've got my thumbnails like we saw before, but I've got this additional option here for layers. This is kind of cool. So quite often in an architectural engineering context, you have different layers from the different parts of the CAD file. So I can turn, it looks like, there we go, I can turn different layers on or off. So if I only wanted to look at the HVAC system, for example, then I could do so. So that's pretty cool, and that's a big, from an engineering point of view, big deal over what PDF offers. Let's check out that hand tool, see, as well. And try zooming. Oh. Zoom performance, not quite as good. It took a lot longer to render than it did in PDF. But this hand tool is great for a large canvas like this for me to move around. Still no shape tools, still no measurement tools, but that's what you get when you get nothing but a viewer, of course. Rendering performance, I'm less impressed with so far. Let's check out the zoom. So this detail spot here, let me try zooming in. So that's pretty good. We're at 1000% zoom. I think, though, that I don't think it's actually rendering anymore. I think if we look at this, it's letting me zoom in further, but from a rendering point of view, we're limited to, I don't know what it is, maybe 400%? Maybe less, actually. This still looks pretty grainy. Rendering performance, certainly not as good as what we got with PDF. All right, let's consider security with PDF.js. Security with PDF.js is a bit better than PDF. The CVE database only tracks 4 major vulnerabilities, with the most recent being back from 2015. However, support may be a larger issue going forward. In a pretty big blow to the open source community, Mozilla laid off more than 300 employees last year and abandoned some of their projects. As such, the long-term health of PDF.js may be in jeopardy if Mozilla were to stop supporting its continued growth. All right, so that's our 2 main open source PDF rendering engines. Let's compare them to a commercial option for PDF. PDF was founded more than 20 years ago and has created one of the only closed source and cross-platform PDF rendering engines on the market. Let's take a look at our test files using PDFtron's WebViewer product and see how it stacks up. Let's start with that standard 2-page document that we looked at before, the legal contract. Load it up from my sample files here. And it loads in fast, but we'd expect that. It's a pretty simple document. Similar panel on the left-hand side, but a few more options here than you'd get with a simple viewer. The ability to extract or delete pages or insert pages. Support for things like digital signatures. Similar page controls coming across the top, but then now the ability to add annotations like you would in a PDF editor, whether it's shapes or text annotations. This is really key in an engineering and a construction context, where you need to add what we call markups on top of a PDF to share comments with your colleagues. The ability to insert different attachments and stamps into the document, or edit the PDF content itself, whether you're cropping the page or deleting PDF content. Being able to fill signatures and add stamps, and as well as the ability to add form fields. Let's look at text selection like we did in the other two viewers. Text selection pretty good. Nice and smooth. Some nice quality of life things like handles to change what sort of you've selected on your document or add a highlight perhaps. Also the ability to redact content and actually remove it from the PDF document itself. Let's look at a little more complicated document now. So loading in this large document really fast, like we saw with pdf.js, where it's streaming in as it's being downloaded onto my computer. I can jump pretty quickly between the different files in the outline here, or the different pages. Let's do a search for our search thing that we looked at before. So as they're popping in here, I can see that I'm getting more than just the actual search term itself and each instance of it. I'm actually getting the context surrounding where that search term is in the document, which makes it a lot easier to actually find the one that I'm looking for. And similar to what we saw in PDFium, being able to find search terms that are broken across a line. So really crucial in a legal or a financial context. Let's look at text selection here with our two columns. Oops. So text selection is pretty good. And here we can see that we're detecting that these are columns and not continued content. But if I select over to the other side, then it'll jump over to the other column as well. So much improved experience over PDFium here. Let's take a look at a CAD file now. So see how that pops in. Renders pretty quickly. Similar experience on the side here. We have the option to turn layers on and off like we saw in pdf.js. So useful feature there for sure. Being able to add the annotations and the measurements really key, like we talked about before. But I think one of the main things that really sets the PDFtron web viewer apart is the ability to render at incredible levels of detail. So as I zoom in here, I'm already at more than 1000%, and I can already see there's a lot more detail than we were able to get in either PDFium or pdf.js. Let's zoom in even more. Now, when we were limited to our 400 or 500% zoom in the other viewers, on a document that doesn't really matter. But when it comes to an engineering and a construction context, this is incredibly important to be able to get in and see all of the detail at almost 10,000% that you get in some CAD or other construction type documents. Let's talk about security. At more than 1,000 pages, the PDF spec is very complex, and there are lots of potential for vulnerabilities. Many of these vulnerabilities revolve around the use of JavaScript, which is disabled by default in the PDFtron SDK. Since the core PDFtron rendering engine was built entirely from the ground up, without open source, the underlying code is not available publicly. In practice, this actually offers a significant deterrent to hackers who will scour publicly available code and vulnerability databases for exploitable weaknesses. That being said, having external eyes on code is also essential to ensuring a product continued stability and security. Because the PDFtron SDK is used by many large organizations and governments, our processes and code are under frequent scrutiny by third-party tools, groups, and audits. At the time of this recording, there are no known PDFtron SDK vulnerabilities. Okay, let's quickly summarize what we talked about. There are lots of freely available PDF libraries out there, but they are almost all based on two main rendering engines, either PDFium or pdf.js. Depending on your use case, these libraries may be adequate for your use. But some of the key limitations that we saw were lack of out-of-the-box features such as annotation, measurement, form, and signature support, many of which are key in the AEC market. We saw that performance with large files can sometimes be poor, and rendering of complex documents and drawings maxed out quickly. And this was a huge problem with a complex CAD file, again, really important in AEC. Search wasn't always 100% reliable and can miss some entries, especially if they're broken across a line. And depending on the library, there may be security or support concerns. When you need to view, annotate, sign, and manipulate PDFs in a mission-critical environment, it can be a significant risk to rely on an open source solution, and you may need to consider a commercial option, such as PDFtron's web viewer. Anyways, hope you enjoyed this talk, and hit us up in the question period if you'd like to cover anything in more detail.